Well, I think the Velvet Underground defined rock music in New York. I mean, I guess before the Velvet Underground, there had been pop groups, doo-wop groups, Brill Building, sort of Carole King, Phil Spector, girl group kind of associated with New York sound. Velvet Underground were rock and roll that was bubbling up from from the feelings of the group itself, rather than being manufactured for a pre-existing audience. All those bands that were that I was talking about before, that you associated with New York, they were created to be commercial. The Velvet Underground were art. They were the which, to me isn't something pretentious. Like original rockabilly was art, in the sense that it was being created by the musicians who were making the music, and the point of it was to release something from inside themselves that expressed their feelings and excited them the way the music that inspired them excited them. It was really direct. There really hadn't been anything like the Velvet Underground before the Velvet Underground. It took me a long time to adjust to the Velvet Underground as a kid. I came from Kentucky to New York, and when I was a teenager, when I first heard the Velvet Underground, when I was 17 or 18, they sounded ludicrous to me. They sounded like a really bad Bob Dylan imitation. That's the only way I could explain it to myself, where they were coming from. With that kind of sneering, non-singing singing, and the music being so crude, with still this simplicity and this kind of natural, instinctively compelling melodies, but played so crudely. But now, after all these years, the Velvet Underground is really the most reliable music there is for me. Of all the bands and of all time in rock and roll, if I want to put on something that will satisfy me, I reach for the Velvet Underground. It's amazing. I don't know how to explain it, except that Lou Reed's instincts were so good. At least they were for that period. In that period, he just, in the way that the best rock and roll does, he just removed everything that wasn't necessary. But you were so used to having all this polish and all these frills that it was hard to adjust to at first. It was for me, but that the Velvet Underground represented New York also because they were so sophisticated. We talk about how crude they are, but in terms of their subject matter, there hadn't been the treatment of that kind of, except maybe in the roots blues, where they would talk about drugs and talk about knife fights and talk about what was actually happening in the lives of the people who were creating the music. That's what the Velvet Underground did, without, it was the opposite of Chuck Berry. I mean, there's a lot to love about Chuck Berry, but his movie was really manufactured for white high school kids. That was his whole purpose, to write about cars and, a sweet little 16, and the Velvet Underground wrote about what you really lived with in New York, which was heroin and sadism, and so that was new, and that it gave them this this kind of standing as a New York band. So yeah, from my point of view, from where I'm coming from, for the music that interests me, they're really the standard. And as far as I'm concerned, nobody has exceeded what they did. You can't really pick out very many groups that you would identify with the Velvet Underground. People say that about people say that about television, and it's definitely true that television was influenced by the Velvets. But the Modern Lovers sure were extremely influenced by the Velvets. But not, and you know, there's the classic line. Maybe you know who first said it. I wonder who did. I don't know. Who said that? You know, only 30 people ever saw the Velvets, but every one of those who did started a band. And that sounds reasonable. But the same reason is true of the Sex Pistols, is that they made it look easy. I mean, it looked easy. It looked like you didn't have to know what you were doing. And while at the same time it was so exciting to see and be in the same room with it. But it was really distinctive, both for the Velvets and the Sex Pistols. Nobody really could reproduce it. Though you can sure pick out a lot of bands that another band that sounds a whole lot like the Velvet Underground is that band Galaxy 500. But in New York, I would say probably television. But television was so much more production oriented. I mean, there was so much more about this crystal clear sound and this very obsessive, fanatical attention to every detail of how the instruments mix with each other, and the exact quality of the sound of each moment of playing, of each separate contribution to the track, whereas the Velvets were all about first take. So I think, you know, it was more the spirit of the Velvet Underground probably that had the strong influence. I mean, the Ramones sure didn't seem very influenced by them, except that except maybe their subject matter, and also just that simplicity. I mean, that was the main thing. I think for the bands that came up at CBGB's was this return to the basics. No frills. Just talking about real life in a kind of music that didn't that was pared down to what was essential. Definitely. I mean, there was, you know, the whole glamour of transgression, and also the opposition to hippies. You know, like that classic moment where Louis goes, and all you protest kids. Where you're just kind of contemptuous of the whole of that whole love and peace delusion. But the thing that always strikes me the most I mean, it was clear, and and Louis and John Cale have never been stingy about crediting Andy Warhol for all they learned from him. And the atmosphere around Warhol and the factory permeated those songs. But what always blows my mind about that is more from the other direction, is how amazing it is that Warhol discovered them. How did he know how great they were? How did it happen? I mean, Warhol just seemed like perfect. Like how does he know so much about what would make for good music, that he could pick out the very best band that of all time, practically, from some little nowhere club in the West Village, and make himself associated with them? It's astonishing. So yeah, there must have been a lot of cross-fertilization going on there between Warhol and his sensibility and what the Velvet are interested in. But it was really defiant too in this anti-commerciality. I mean, you know, obviously Lou Reed had this amazing instinct for a really irresistible melody arrangement pop song, but it was undermined all the time by how crudely he presented it without any, you know, it sounded so sloppy on the surface. And then furthermore, in those early days, they would go on these long noise 45-minute jams that would just empty halls. I mean, there was a famous line of Warhol's to them of advice about how to regard the audience, namely, always leave them wanting less. But you know, still though, music is brilliant. I don't think there's any band that is so flawless in their bootlegs. You know, every show that Velvet Underground ever played was good, because you know, a lot of them were recorded, and those recordings are out there, and they're fantastic. They're all great. Well, you know, my interest in poetry is almost exchangeable with interest in rock and roll. It was basically about wanting to live by my wits and have pretty girls like me. You know, I mean, it's. But I didn't have any background in music, and it never occurred to me. Whereas I love to read, and and so for me, the role model that existed was poets, because being a pop musician just seemed so remote. I mean, you couldn't conceive of how that happened. How people got there to where, you know, all you knew about them was buying a record in a record store or seeing somebody on TV, and yeah. So, but the two ambitions weren't really that apart for me. When I got frustrated with the prospects of getting anywhere, like making my presence felt and writing. And I saw these examples of how people, namely the New York Dolls, were able to stir things up in a way that I could understand. I could see that it looked like it was something I could do. I jumped on it. Well, I didn't hesitate for a moment. But at the same time, my values for what was interesting to do in the work came a lot from those poets. But those poets also, the ones who interested me, had more or less the same kind of values as rock and roll. It was about living outside of society and seeing the hypocrisy in the normal world, and living for kind of hedonistically and outside of convention. Well, yeah, New York was just the most advanced, sophisticated, culturally enlightened, exciting place in America or the world, as far as I could see. It was just where the best of everything existed, and where everyone went who wanted to wanted to figure out how to do best whatever it was that they wanted to do, because this was where the best work was being done. No, for me, I came in at a kind of point where I kind of consciously chose those French writers as opposed to the Beats, because the Beats were too much of a cliche at that point. It was kind of tired by then. It just they'd already peaked, and it wasn't interesting to go that route. You wanted to find something that would be more yours instead of something that everybody and their little brother thought of as hip. Well, it was just evidence that there's a way to get things going. Without having without having to know some secret about connection to a record company or something, that you could just take the initiative and do it. And those shows were really exciting. Tom was less excited by them as a group than by seeing their example for their example of taking your fate into your own hands and doing it yourself. But I thought they were really thrilling. But it's funny, and it was another thing. Someday I'll have to write an essay about this or something, because it's odd that it happened twice on both those bands that were kind of like the immediate predecessors and inspirations for the bands at CBGB's. As to me, the Velvet Underground seemed like almost like a parody of Dylan, a kind of in a slightly more inept version of Dylan. The Dolls, of course, were like a parody of, or a slightly more inept version of the Rolling Stones. But it's funny, you get over that, and you see these bands for what they're bringing themselves, rather than the way they're indebted to, or what they have in common with groups that they learned some things from and who were more popular than they were. But the amazing thing about the Dolls was the spirit of excitement and of them being the voice of a whole of a whole underground world of New York that hadn't had expression until they arrived. You know, the Dolls and their audience were one. They kind of created each other. The Dolls came out of this, but they also, you know, it's like what happens at a good rock concert, where you know, all the kind of exhilaration and release and excitement is a thing that gets passed back and forth between the band and the crowd. You need it from both sides for it to really, and that happened on this whole bigger scale with the Dolls and the kids for whom they were playing, who were like, you know, the kind of just at the end of hippie, but still hippie, but at the same time this kind of transvestite oriented and glamour and camp kind of Warhol sensibility, kids who had come to New York to get away from their, you know, constricting conservative small town upbringings, and every show was like a party and an orgy and like a trip. It was just this. It was, you know, it really was like a big party. It was more like you could not separate between the people on stage and the people in the crowd. It was, and that was really thrilling. You did not have to be a virtuoso, and you did not have to have some. You did not have to tailor your work to a pre-existing crowd. You could just be yourself, do what excited you, take the initiative, and the music industry would come to you. You know, that would happen. But also, you know, it was this confirmation that rock and roll was not about virtuosity, and it's not. I mean, that's half the identity of rock and roll. I mean, what makes rock and roll is that it's what unschooled kids can do. It's, in fact, it's the only medium that's about not being especially good at anything. It's about just having the instincts, and that's why it's a teenage medium, because you're not any good at anything yet when you're a teenager. You're all instinct, and so it's just about instincts. Rock and roll is about instincts. It's about you know, confidence and determination to make yourself heard and felt, and about just it's just about that natural gracefulness that comes from being tuned into your, you know, to your inner self, unselfconsciously. Yeah, it's not about skill. It's about getting it. It's just about, you know, I get it. We didn't go often. We just went to 2 or 3 shows. But it was like going to a basketball game or something like that, where it was the home team, you know. You couldn't help getting caught up in the excitement. I mean, both Tom and I were kind of proud, and we couldn't give ourselves over to something completely that was that we didn't originate. And once the dolls, the dolls weren't really our world. I mean, that's why we came up with something else. We kind of offered a kind of alternative to the dolls in a way, like we were the next step. So we didn't really we didn't really release ourselves into the dolls' whole world, and we weren't really a part of that kind of subculture. But it was inspiring, and you could really appreciate what was going on, and what was unleashed in those shows. But yeah, we weren't in that, like we were kind of observers. Yeah, it was kind of disappointing. I mean, I think that album cover was a mistake. And they had a history with that. I mean, that Malcolm perpetuated when he dressed them in red leather and put a communist flag behind them. It was pretty consistent. I mean, but New York, I mean, they were successful in New York, and in a way you could and LA too, for that matter. I mean, there's a big difference between how rock and roll is treated in England and is treated in America. And America is so much bigger, and it takes so much more penetration to arrive in America. Whereas in England, everything flows from London, and if something is big in London, it's big in the whole country. Whereas that's not true in America. It's a real challenge to go from local success in LA, New York, to this huge mass of middle America in between. But also, with hindsight, it's easy to see how they were kind of doomed with, pretty quickly Johnny and Jerry, chose drugs over music. Yeah, well, the Neon Boys was just when we first started playing, writing and playing songs together, me and Verlaine, and ultimately Billy Ficca, the drummer. So yeah, that happened. That started like in 1972 or something like that. I guess it was 1972 that we started writing songs and rehearsing a little bit, looking for another guitar player. Yeah, so that was our first incarnation as a band. With up until that, Tom had just been kind of noodling around on acoustic guitar, and once or twice a year going to a hootenanny night, where an open mic night at a folk club or something. But I'd gotten pessimistic and disillusioned about prospects of making anything happen in poetry, of having any impact. And the dolls were inspiring, and we were also inspired by stuff that was going on in England too. Like Slade and T-Rex and Bowie too, for that matter. Where there was a return to more kind of pared down, hard driving music, you know. So yeah, that's what we were calling ourselves when we were first starting out. But we could never find a second guitar player. We had some auditions and none of them panned out, and so the Neon Boys just kind of only exist as a prospect, you know, for what we were. It's what we were calling ourselves as we looked for the guitar player that would enable us to play live, and we never found that guitar player, so we never played live. And the only music that exists of that lineup is a few tapes we made in a 4-track studio at the point where we were giving up because we couldn't find a guitar player, and we couldn't keep the drummer on the payroll any longer. He wasn't really on a payroll. He was working as a messenger, but he had moved to New York in order to be in the band, and so we couldn't kid ourselves that. Anyway, so we made a few recordings that eventually got you know, small releases. But yeah, that was when we first started playing. A mutual friend, a guy that Verlaine and I knew, suggested Lloyd 2 or 3 months after we'd given up looking, and so we basically auditioned him, and he sounded like he would work. So then we started rehearsing again, and we thought we'd look for a new name for the group, and that was Television. Yeah. Once Richard Lloyd arrived, we were capable of playing live because it was 2 guitar music. Basically, Tom showed Richard his parts. He learned. He was told what to play by Tom, but it enabled us to play live. And so then we had to start looking for a venue, and or you know, find a way to present ourselves. And I thought that the way that the Dolls had been associated with this particular outlet, the Mercer Art Center, was brilliant because it meant, as a house band, you could rely on being able to see the group when you went to that venue, rather than having to expend the energy to go search for where the band you were interested in might be appearing next. So I hoped that we could find a club that would let us be the house band. And it didn't seem like it should be a problem, because times were hard back then, and there were lots of little nowhere dives that were just barely hanging on. So it seemed like it should work, that if we found a place that seemed likely, that we proposed to the owner, you let us set up here and play on, you know, on weekends, and allow us to charge at the door. We'll bring in crowds who will buy drinks, and you, of course, can continue to allow any of your regulars in if you want, without forcing them to pay a cover charge. And so that was what we were hoping to arrange. And we spotted this club. Hilly had just bought the club in December of 1973, and we'd approached him in February or March, just after he of '74, and we played our first date there in early April, I think it was. And we immediately got attention. So we played there successive Sundays for a few months, and then other bands started appearing. Within that first 8 months or so. I mean, the Ramones showed up in the fall, like August or something like that. The Stilettos showed up before that, within 3 or 4 months. The Stilettos, who included Debbie Harry and Chris Stein, who had formed Blondie. Patti Smith actually wrote about television, because I'd been working with Patti on a book. I was printing books as a publisher in those days, a series of books. And we were working on one together. And I said, "You've got to come see my band." And so she came and saw the band, and she responded and wrote about us in the local weekly. And then at that point, she was giving poetry readings, but she would have Lenny Kaye come up and play guitar with her for 10 minutes during the course of her poetry reading, and she would do this kind of recitation, and it would break into music. So she started focusing more on the music, and started appearing at CBGB's then too in 1974, within a few months of seeing us there. I had a sort of relationship to the world and existence that I hadn't seen expressed elsewhere, and I wanted to express it in the songs that I was writing. I didn't really know for sure that anybody else felt the same way. But I did like the genre of generation songs. Like the Who's My Generation and rockabilly kind of stuff, like Don't Step on My Blue Suede Shoes, that was kind of like expressing the way the kids of this alive at that moment felt towards the world. I looked at the band as an opportunity to, and it was also a kind of reaction against hippiness, which felt like unrealistic and dead to me. It was a delusion, and it was over. It had failed, and it had never really it was doomed from the beginning because it was unrealistic. And I felt, to me, my reaction to the world was partly a kind of numbness, that because in the previous 6 or 8 years, everybody had been battered around so badly between the Vietnam War and Watergate, and all the ways in which you were seeing that what you've been brought up to think the world was like were false, and that there was nothing to really believe in, and everything was hopeless. And the only response was to just turn away from it, reject everything. So, you know, that's where love comes in spurts. I belong to the blank generation. You know, this song you mentioned that I wrote that called "I Don't Care," which actually in television, the idea I had for that was that the three of us up front, me and Tom and Richard, would each sing a different verse of each one describing what they didn't care about. You Gotta Lose. Those were all songs that I wrote in television. So yeah, it was definitely, there was a certain mentality that I was putting forth. I mean, I knew that it was just kind of like throwing out some bait and seeing if they would get any nibbles. And you know, to me, they would still be good songs and interesting material, whether or not it actually was something that described a widespread point of view. I mean, they weren't dependent on being you know, I could belong to the blank generation and there was only one of us. Like, I was kind of idealistic in spite of, without being aware of it, you know, even though all this material was about being kind of disillusioned, there was still this kind of idealism in that. I thought I was promoting this concept of taking taking matters into your own hands. The way that I dressed and everything, which was also an expression of, because that was something I always really liked about rock and roll, was that it was a whole way of life. You know, it had you dressed in a way that was consistent with your emotional and intellectual message too, and what you named the band, and then even for me, what I named myself. I wanted all those things to be consistent, but the idea was to demonstrate how you could reinvent yourself, and that was part of what was really thrilling about rock and roll. But I realized eventually that was kind of idealistic and a delusion too, because of course what happened was instead everybody copies what you do rather than invent themselves. They think they take you as a model, and just do, you know, imitate you. Well, different people bought into that sense of the place more than others. To me, it was like that for a while, and then that was encouraging and exciting, the way that there was a new movement taking place at CBGB's, and the bands were mutually supportive, you know, because everybody had certain things in common. But other people were more snobs about it, and other people were completely indifferent to it. You know, other people, it was just like every man for himself, or I'm the only interesting thing here, and everybody else is just riding my coattails. Or there was all kinds of different. You get all kinds of different answers to that question. But to me, whatever there was there in terms of kind of a common mission, it didn't last very long. I mean, the CBGBs was really over by 1978 anyway. Once the bands got contracts, they all went their separate ways. Everybody, then it really was every man for himself. But to me, I don't think anybody. I'm only speaking for myself. In fact, I know this is just my personal interpretation. That partly comes from what my own intentions were. But to me, what was different about what was going on at CBGB's was that it was about bringing real life back to rock and roll. After all these years of this greater and this increasing amount of kind of star worship and limousine, stadium, commerciality, theatrical idea of rock and roll musicians being these idols. CBGB's was about bringing rock and roll back to daily life, real life of the kids who were living it, without all this pretension, without all this fake virtuosity. That, I mean, none of that music has survived. Whether it's symphonic or just about this separated existence on some plane of idol worship. CBGBs was bringing it back to real life, talking about real life, and being made by people who rejected all that nonsense. So that's what we had in common. I do think, that was something that was it was unusual, but I don't know who besides Patty and I represented that, but that we had theories about rock and roll and ideas about what was interesting in rock and roll, apart from intellectual. I mean, we had intellectual ideas about what we were trying to do. Always before, rock and roll had been thought to be primitive, like basically moronic, and in a way it's possible to be smart and be moronic at the same time. I mean, Iggy Pop is really smart, and you can't get much more moronic than the Stooges. But it was kind of in that generation where it was which I guess was sort of the generation that grew up with rock and roll. I mean, people like Lou Reed and Iggy, and then Patty and me, whose whole lives had who weren't in the first generation of rock and roll, who'd actually had rock and roll from when they were children, that had this combination of not of knowing that we weren't stupid, but knowing that that wasn't anything to be proud of, that there wasn't really a dichotomy between being, you know, kind of intellectual, kind of thoughtful, kind of curious about the world, kind of, you know, somebody who reads, who thinks, but also is more interested in what rock and roll does, which has nothing to do with any of those things. But it doesn't mean that you can't have those things and do rock and roll well. I mean, to me, that was also part of what was cool about doing rock and roll, was that I knew that I was capable as a writer, and I wasn't going to dumb myself down as a writer in rock and roll. I was going to be use all my chops and be as a writer as eloquent and stimulating as I could possibly be, without while understanding that rock and roll isn't about that. It's not really about the lyrics, but it doesn't do any harm to have well-written lyrics. It doesn't hurt it. But no song was ever good because its lyrics were well written. What rock and roll does is different. It's physical. Rock and roll is physical and about energy and attitude. But it was fun to bring in this element of intellectuality without being ashamed of it, but without like you know, attaching too much importance to it. But it's true, the thing you brought up about the New Wave, that was an interesting point, in that, I mean, the thing about the New Wave, French New Wave, was that they started out being writers about movies and then became movie directors. That wasn't exactly true of the CBGB's band, but I see what you mean, and it is relevant. I mean, that we were people who thought about rock and roll. Some of us were, anyway. I mean, that always seemed to me really true of the Ramones too, though there's never really been discussed by them, and I don't know how self-conscious they were about it, but it did seem they reminded me of Andy Warhol, in that they came up with an image they wanted to present, and stuck with it. They were like an art project, even though, you know, just in you know, consistent with all this stuff that I was just saying about the mixture of brains and rock and roll. Their whole message was about being stupid. You know, the music as crude as it could possibly be. You know, just a couple of chords and just blaring guitar without ever any solos, and lyrics that were just about almost brain damaged. You know. Now I want to sniff some glue and beat on the brat with a baseball bat. But it was all obviously very calculated. You know, they came up with a uniform for themselves. The songs were were totally consistent. They never departed from this very strong formula. And you can't be like that without intending to. It wasn't just because that's all they could do, because they decided that's what they wanted to do. It was very self-conscious in a way, you know, and that's something that to me seems to fall into that same kind of view of what we were doing, of it being of it being the first generation that of making the music where it wasn't just purely unselfish, spontaneous. It was calculated, but with exactly the right intentions. It wasn't calculated to be commercial. It wasn't calculated to fit a to please a preconceived audience. It was calculated to be true to what rock and roll was what it meant and what its reality and identity was. But it was thought through, not just not just instinctive. There was some analysis going on of what was interesting to do, and then deciding to do that rather than it just being unselfconscious and spontaneous. Well, television was basically Tom. I mean, and once we started getting attention, our approaches, the ideas we had about where we wanted to go started to diverge. Yeah, he wanted to. He wanted to capture these really elaborate, very carefully designed sounds that he heard in his head. It was really personal. They were mostly built around guitar playing, and what I wanted to do had a lot more to do with spirit. It couldn't have to do with exquisite instrument playing, because I couldn't play, but I was never pretending that I could play. You can make great rock and roll with the most simplest means, and that's the only way I can make great rock and roll, because I didn't have enough experience playing, and I wasn't interested enough in devoting myself to bass musicianship to have that be. To me, I was a songwriter and a singer who played bass because it was convenient. And my values in rock and roll had to do with all the things that I've described to you. It was almost mystical. Whereas for Tom, it became very quickly about him being able to capture these very intricate, specific interlocking parts, all of which he conceived, and that was the purpose of having a band. And I wasn't interested in being a bass player in Tom's band, and that's and that's what being in television eventually became clear was the only role for me. So it became clear pretty quickly that I was going to have to leave. Yeah. No, I mean, I didn't have any discussions with Johnny and Jerry about them leaving the Dolls or me leaving television before it happened. We played that gig, and I didn't know Johnny that well. I mean, that's the only time we ever played with them, and he would come around to CBGB's and he'd seen me play, and we sat around and had drinks together. But the Dolls were still like they were they were on a level above, because they were making records, and they had such a big impact in New York. Though, you know, it was pretty clear after the release of that first record, and then the second record really was, you know, a decline for sure. That, you know, it's pretty clear that things were kind of falling apart there, though. No, we hadn't discussed it. What happened is that I just got a phone call from him. He'd heard that I left the band, and he and Jerry had just decided to leave the Dolls, and he wanted to make a band with me. So, but yeah, there wasn't any discussion in advance. It wasn't like, listen, I'm ready to leave television, are you guys ready to leave the Dolls? Nothing like that. No, I was surprised, really surprised when I heard from him. I didn't know the Dolls, I didn't know that he was going to leave the Dolls, and when they were in Florida, he called me from Florida, as I recall. I think I'm right about that. Though maybe he'd just come back to New York from there. But anyway, I was surprised he found out so quickly that I'd left television, because it was within a couple of days of my having decided I was leaving. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the way that we talked about it being, and you know, what our plans for the Heartbreakers were the same as what television was when we first started television, which is that there were two singers and songwriters in the group. And television was me and Tom, and Heartbreakers was me and Johnny. And that pretty much we'd share the singing and songwriting. Though actually in the Heartbreakers, the assumption was that I'd be doing more of it, that Johnny would be, because he had never really been a singer, and at the beginning in television, I was singing like every third song, and the idea was I would be singing more as I wrote more, and it ended up going the other direction. But they were basically inviting me to be the singer, though it was understood that Johnny would be writing some songs too, and he'd be singing the ones he wrote. But when we started, it was pretty even, because I didn't want to try to do the songs with the Heartbreakers that Tom and I had written together, and that was the majority of the ones that I'd done on television. I'd only written maybe 3 or 4 by myself, because when I first started, I was just writing lyrics until I got a better idea of how you go about writing music. So there were, you know, 4 or 5 songs that I'd done in television that Tom had written the music for, and I didn't want to do those. I wanted the ones that I did with the Heartbreakers to be ones that I just wrote myself. So I only had 3 or 4 songs to start with, and he had 3 or 4 already, you know, that he'd written. So it was pretty even. Yeah, we immediately had a following. I mean, it wasn't like we had to build an audience, yeah, because there'd been enough people who had been into what I was doing, and enough people who had been into what he was doing. So, yeah, we were immediately at the same level as the most successful local groups. Yeah. Well, you know, yeah, definitely New York was completely riddled with narcotics at that time. It was half the economy of the Lower East Side. I mean, basically this area here, it was like a war zone. It was abandoned buildings, burnout blocks, and the economy was basically heroin, and it just pervaded the area. and for us, we could, at that time, it was early enough in our exposure to heroin that, I mean, you know, it's built into rock and roll to break the rules and to reject the advice of your elders, and to indulge yourself, and instant gratification. And heroin was about all of those things. And everybody felt as if they could outsmart it. You know, I mean, you knew you'd had to do it every day for some weeks in order to get a habit, and you didn't really think, and you thought that could never happen to me. And even when you did get a small habit where your nose might start running if you didn't do dope for a day, and that was almost like a badge of honor, you know, just because you were that far removed from ordinary society. And it was almost like almost like adult, you know. You entered the you mature, you become mature somehow by having a dope habit. But we were really naive, you know. I mean, we didn't really know. I mean, everybody gets into heroin naively. You don't really understand what you're doing to yourself. So it was everywhere, and there was a lot of exposure to it, and we did kind of affirm it, you know. But I mean, that song is about how it's ruined everything for you. But at the same time, truly, when you write a song like that, there's something, in some way you're affirming it, you know, you're bragging about it, just, you know. But yeah, definitely dope was played a big role in the environment. I got more and more ambitious about what I, you know, and in a way it's kind of ironic, because it's like I eventually realized that I wanted to have the kind of control of a group that Tom realized that he wanted to have control after he'd you know, been in a group for a while. Yeah, I wanted a band where I could try doing things that just wouldn't interest Johnny or Jerry. I mean, whether it was you know, more kind of exotic ideas of what solos would be like, or you know, like extended sections, or just messing with the possibilities. Whereas they were really about driving basic rock and roll, coming out of like you know, Eddie Cochran or whatever. That's all they were interested in doing. It was, and they did it great, and I loved being a part of it. But I wanted to try other kinds of stuff, and it just wouldn't have worked with the Heartbreakers. So. Yeah, I was really happy with the Voidoids. So you know, at the same time, I kind of cultivated this ignorance about music. I mean, it took me a long time to realize that was probably a mistake. But it actually, you know, it served its purpose in a way too. I mean, as I was saying before, I was almost kind of mystical about music. I felt like it was really about getting into the zone, more or less, rather than making plans and thinking through, what part works best here and best there. And I felt like it was about intensity and emotion, and just having faith in that you could make this direct connection by just exploding out, just throwing yourself without any inhibitions or reservations or any holding back, into throwing yourself into the material as you performed it. And I relied on that rather than any understanding of song structure or any kind of skill as a bass player, and it did create some very unique and intense and successful moments, but it was kind of rough on the band, and it did make for some very unusual compositions. But to me, that record still does hold up, though it is kind of an acquired taste. I mean, you have to be susceptible to its kind of to the value of the kind of intensity that it has, for it to work for you. But yeah, the band, I mean, I don't know. I feel like I must have been doing something right, because how I could have attracted the guitar players I attracted has to mean something. I mean, the three guitar players who wanted me to be in their bands were by far the most interesting guitar players, in thousands of miles. Verlaine and Thunders and Quine, and it's probably good that I didn't really. It's probably just as well that I didn't really realize how great Quine was. Quite, I mean, basically he worked for me, and he did what I told him to do, It took me a long time to really understand how exceptional he was. I mean, I sure respected and appreciated him when hardly anybody else did. I mean, nobody else could see past his bald head. I mean, I was proud of myself that I had the that I had the courage to take a bald-headed guy into my band, and that I could recognize how exceptional he was as a musician and a person, despite his bald head. But I didn't really know until years later. I mean, I actually feel like he's the best pure rock and roll soloist in all of rock and roll history. I really believe that, and he didn't get very much chance to show it. I mean, there's only 4 or 5 songs with me that and we never recorded very well live, because I just wanted everything so loud. so all of those are almost wasted, his solos, even when they somebody was taping them, you can hardly hear what he's playing. And he was kind of wasted by most of the people he played with after me. He did a few good solos for Lou Reed, but Lou Reed didn't really give him the respect he deserved. So there's not that much evidence to base it on, because he only really got to show what he could do. And, well, I only made 2 records. And the stray demos here and there that turn up on the other 3 or 4 records that we managed to mine from the time that the band existed. But I only really made 2 studio albums, and so there's not that, he doesn't get that much chance to demonstrate what he could do. But I really believe he's the best guitar soloist in the history of rock and roll. I've started rehearsing the Voidoids after I left the Heartbreakers. I started rehearsing the Voidoids in June or July, and I signed my contract with Sire in January, 6 months later. Television, I know, were negotiating for a long time. They got offers that they turned down. Tom was just like difficult. I mean, they probably could have signed a year before they did. Patty signed in 1975, a year after she started playing. The Ramones in 76, a year and a half after they started playing. And everybody else in 77. It didn't seem like, it seemed like it all happened really quickly. I mean, when we started off, we were all, everybody thought we were all too primitive and aggressive and eccentric and obscure, but everybody got signed, I mean, and for me, this was from when I first picked up a bass. Usually people are playing in bands for 6 or 8 years before they get signed. For me, I'd only been playing in bands at all for 2 years before I was signed. So it seemed really quick to me. No, I felt like the songs that I'd written the longest time before, which I guess the longest time before would have been something like 3 years, were the bands that were the songs that came out the best, because they'd had the most time to evolve, and I knew better how to direct the band and playing them. The problem was more that always half the material that I had something to do with I didn't want to use, because I'd co-written with other band members in the bands I had left. So I needed to, I mean, we wrote 2/3 of that album in the 6 months before it was recorded, and that to me has led to some weaknesses. It wasn't the songs that had been around, like Up Comes the Spurs and Blank Generation. They actually were way better in the Voidoids versions than they had been in the versions played by the bands that might have played them earlier on before I formed the Voidoids. But then there were a number of songs that hadn't really had a chance to evolve, and but yeah, so no, I didn't feel like any song suffered from having had a history. It was only improved. Yeah. the main difference was, of course, that it was a huge popular movement in England, whereas, as I said before, in America it was New York and to some extent, but then we're talking about new rock and roll of that kind of generation having some impact. It was only in New York, really. When the Dolls were happening, there was also in L.A., but it took L.A. Another year and a half to catch up with what we were doing in New York after the Dolls. So it was really only New York. Whereas in England, it was massive. It was the headline news all the time, and it was a whole different culture. But it was also it was very chauvinistic. You know, I mean, the Clash have a song like "I'm So Bored with the USA." It was all about promoting pride in the kids. You know, which was also true about what we were doing in New York. And rock and roll had always been about anarchy. You know, that's what rock and roll is. It's wild in the streets. You know, it's about no rules. So to me, the political thing really just seemed. To me, it was just superficial as a way of distinguishing between New York and England. I mean, the whole idea of pride in your rejected self was about rock and was built into rock and roll. The bands in England got a little more explicit about it, in you know, using the word anarchy in a song, but to me that wasn't a big departure. The difference was that it had clicked, and there were a lot of ways to explain that, but ultimately the reason it happened was that the Sex Pistols were so good. I mean, it came down to they had it all. They did everything right, and they were just magic that way. It did seem unbelievable that all this stuff fell together the way it did around that band. Whether it was what Malcolm brought or Lydon brought, or whatchamacallit, the bass player who wrote all the songs?
Sid Vicious.
What?
Oh, Glenn Matlock.
Yeah, Glenn Matlock. He wrote the fucking songs. And then Sid Vicious, who, you know, just took it to the next level of in-your-face fuck you-ness, you know. And the productions were so well done. But you know, so England was the perfect breeding ground too, because there were all these kids with nothing to do, and the whole country was oriented around rock and roll anyway. It was the only thing the country had to be proud of since World War II. Was it's the culture, what it contributed to rock and roll in the world. It was the only export England had, really. And you know, there were like 5 weekly newspapers. In America, there was not a single weekly rock and roll newspaper. Whereas you had Sounds, NME, Melody Maker, and God knows what other smaller scale ones. There was the whole country took pride and had all this focus on youth music, because that's the only thing it had to be proud of. What else did it have? You know, it had the British invasion of the 60s, and now here it was 2 or 3 years later, and there was something to pay attention to again, and to get excited about. So it was headlines all the time, whereas in America it was nothing like that. And you know, in America still, even though the Sex Pistols got a fair amount of attention on a certain level, they sure never had a hit record, not anywhere near a hit record. So there was this feeling of it was a strange feeling of knowing that a lot of the stuff that was going on in England had originated in New York and that we'd created, but at the same time they were trying to set themselves apart from us, which you know, so it was a little bit demoralizing because of that, you know. And the whole world of for me, the whole world of living in, of living on the level of pop culture, once you'd arrived to the point of making a record, it got kind of oppressive. I mean, where it was just all interviews and bands competing with each other and traveling from smelly club to smelly club where you're just treated like garbage and being expected at the same time by journalists to be some kind of spokesman for your peers. And it was just it was all, and the life was boring. I mean, being on the road is just tedium, and trying to do something real on a stage every night is almost impossible. You know, it would be really frustrating because the whole point of why you began doing this was that you wanted to break through barriers, you know. But it was almost impossible for it not just to become like a routine, because you're doing it every night and you're exhausted and you're hungover, and maybe you're drug sick. I mean, the whole rock and roll doesn't just, and music in general is true of jazz too, doesn't just isn't just susceptible to drug temptations because you're an outsider who's trying, you know, who rejects ordinary standards and believes in self-gratification instantly, but also because it's so boring being on the road. The drugs become tempting just because they give you release from the repetition and the lack of anything to do. You know, you're just getting on a bus, going to check into another hotel is just as alike as all the buses are, with just enough time to go to some stinky club where they treat you like you're subhuman, to do a sound check, maybe get a bite to eat and get a shower before you have to come back and pretend like you're some oracle, and then be exhausted and fall asleep and get up and start all over again the next morning. You know, who wouldn't want to do a drug in that situation? So yeah, to me, the arriving at the point of what so-called success was was the beginning of the end, you know, because it was a horrible life and almost impossible to do with any degree of, you know, self-respect and honesty.